And welcome back to this week's edition of Doctor and the Dude. I am not the doctor. I'm meteorologist Steve Glazier. In fact, the doctor is out of the office currently. But happy to step in for Dr. Jim Siebert here with the dude, Mr. Josh Morgerman, back from a busy few weeks of hunting hurricanes. And Josh's most recent experience took him to follow, at least one of the most recent experiences, was to follow Major Hurricane Ian. So welcome to this week's edition of Doctor and the Dude. Josh, now that you're kind of getting back settled into your home, what did you think of Hurricane Ian?
Well, I mean, without a doubt, no matter how you slice it, no matter how you measure it, no matter how you evaluate it, Ian was an historic storm, not just for Florida, but for the United States. This was a big impact, a 150-mile-an-hour hurricane making a direct impact on a very populated region. And the results are honestly not surprising. That's what you get when you have a high-end Category 4 hurricane colliding with an area like it did, a populated area with a lot of cities and towns and coastal property.
And before Ian hit, I know that, Josh, you're constantly looking at every new weather model update, and there were two big discrepancies. Will this thing go toward, or even a few, will it go farther west and north, or will it hook east and to the right? Ended up being that latter, hooking into the Fort Myers, Cape Coral area in southwestern Florida. What was your big takeaway with that, and how difficult was that for planning purposes, really?
Yeah, this was a very interesting scenario. It echoed the Hurricane Charley scenario in 2004 in a lot of ways, where you had a hurricane moving parallel to the west coast of Florida. And when you have a hurricane moving parallel to a coastline, it creates all kinds of headaches in terms of figuring out where it's going to come ashore, because a slight change in the heading of the storm will have massive implications in terms of where the landfall point is. And like Charley, it looked like Ian kind of hooked right a little more than expected. Now, one thing I want to say is that the entire area that was impacted was well within the hurricane warning zone and within the hurricane center's sort of the cone, as we call it. So no one should have been surprised, but I think that those little changes last minute really do have implications. Now, if Ian had stayed offshore and gone and come ashore further north, it would have been much weaker. That's what the computer models were showing, that if it got up to the panhandle, the Big Bend area, it was going to have room and time to start to fall apart. Unfortunately, it hooked far enough east that it came in strong.
And that was the scenario we didn't want to happen. It came in faster, stronger into that area that perhaps folks expecting it to go farther north toward Tampa, but it ended up not being the scenario. So I know the National Hurricane Center years ago, a couple of years ago at least, removed the center line of the forecast track just to include the whole cone, and that folks shouldn't just concentrate on that one direct line. As you're watching hurricanes, take me through that process, and are you truly looking at the whole cone of possibility for landfalls?
I do look at the cone, and of course I'm also looking at the computer models myself. And I noticed that morning that some of them, like the H-Mon, started to kind of turn east and show a more intense further south landfall. And then of course the alarm bells went off, because not only would it come in stronger, but come in a really populated area, the Fort Myers metro area. But that morning, the morning of the hurricane was really a surprise. The other big thing that happened was that episode of RI, rapid intensification, that happened right before landfall. That's something that, we all dread happening. And what's interesting is with these Gulf Coast hurricanes, we've had several instances of that over the last few years. Ian was the latest, but Laura did it. Hurricane Michael did it. These hurricanes that just rapidly intensified just before coming ashore. It is everyone's biggest nightmare, and this has been a tough run for the U.S. Gulf Coast in terms of rapid intensification before landfall.
And it's been a tough handful of years for the Gulf Coast landfalls, too. So, Josh, I know we look at this video from Southwest Florida. We look through a screen, and you lose a bit of the impact. You still see the images, but you were there the day after, Ian's landfall there in Southwest Florida. And I know you can't speak for them directly, but what are the folks going through there in parts of South Florida?
This was a major impact. This isn't the kind of thing where like, okay, in 2 weeks, folks are going to have their power back and there'll be some blue tarps. This was massive devastation. It reminds me a little bit of Hurricane Katrina here in Mississippi, where I think that the recovery process is going to go on for a long, long time. This is going to be, major disruption to people's lives and displacement of populations for potentially years to come in the kind of Fort Myers Beach region up to Charlotte Harbor. I can't emphasize enough what a big impact this was. And I think that we need to remember just nationally, keep this story in the news because they're going to need our help. Just nationally, we're going to need to come together and help this area get back on its feet.
I know. And you think back to previous hurricanes in this season. You think of Puerto Rico being impacted, then the next one into Florida, then moved into the Carolinas. So it gets back in the thought process. But I just want to quickly ask you before we wrap up. You've been into so many hurricanes' eyes. What was it like in the center of Ian?
Ian had a strangely, what I call a dirty eye. Usually the more intense a hurricane is, the more clean the eye is. There's like blue sky above and everything else. Ian had kind of a dirty eye. The other thing I noticed about it was the backside. The part of the hurricane that hit after the calm eye was very intense, more than we expected.
And that was the second half after going through the first half of that. One last question. We got about 30 seconds left with you. Did you want to add anything else today, Josh?
Just that we're in an incredible run of hurricanes hitting the United States. We've had 6 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes in the last 6 years. That's pretty unusual.
I know, and after that decade-long drought, we didn't go for it a while, mid-2000s to mid-2010s. Not a good stretch. All right, Mr. Josh Morgerman, thank you so much for joining us with this week's edition of Doctor and the Dude.